Hey y'all! It's entry number 64 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Mark Andrews, tight end, Baltimore Ravens. We'll start with the positives with Mark Andrews' fantasy profile. Number one option on the team. Mark Andrews led the 2021 Baltimore Ravens in targets with 153. The team also traded away the number two guy in terms of targets in 2021 in Marquise Brown, who had 146 targets. In terms of target share, Andrews had the highest rate in the NFL last year among tight ends, with a 26.6% target share according to Player Profiler. Clearly, he's going to be the Ravens' top receiving option again in 2022, and should be among the league leaders in tight end targets. This volume makes him much more intriguing to invest in from a fantasy perspective. The next thing I really like about Mark Andrews' fantasy profile is that he's got a tight end friendly play caller. The Ravens' offensive play caller, Greg Roman, has been pretty tight end friendly over the course of his career, with his tight end room as a whole averaging over 60 receiving yards and 0.5 receiving touchdowns per game over the course of his entire 131 game career as an offensive coordinator. By having a tight end friendly coach, it makes it easier for Andrews to be successful. The last thing I really like about Mark Andrews' fantasy profile is his red zone usage. Mark Andrews has been one of the best tight ends in the league in the red zone over the course of his career. He's seen 11 red zone targets in 2018, the second best on the Ravens, 19 red zone targets in 2019, the best on the Ravens, 20 red zone targets in 2020, the best on the Ravens, and 20 red zone targets again in 2021, the best on the Ravens according to NFL Savant. This high level of red zone usage has led to Andrews catching 29 touchdowns in 62 career regular season games. By frequently being utilized in the red zone, it raises the scoring potential and therefore fantasy potential for Mark Andrews in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Mark Andrews' fantasy profile. The Ravens potentially going back to their old run-heavy ways. It's no secret that the Ravens have generally preferred to take a run-heavy approach with their team over the last few years, with 547 rushing attempts in 2018, 596 rushing attempts in 2019, 555 rushing attempts in 2020, and 517 rushing attempts in 2021 according to NFL.com. But last year's injuries to the running back room and the defensive secondary led to them having to pass the ball more than they would like due to the game scripts and the personnel they had. It was the worst passing defense that one of John Harbaugh's teams has ever had. If they do go back to their run-focused ways, it will be more difficult for Andrews to put up the numbers he did last year. The next concern I have with Mark Andrews' fantasy profile is that he's coming off a career year, and whether or not he will maintain similar production in 2022. Whenever a player is coming off a career year, they can be a little riskier to invest in the next year because their draft cost will be at an all-time high as well. Mark Andrews is coming off a career year where he put up 107 receptions on 153 targets for 1,361 receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns. On a per-game basis, he averaged 2.02 more receptions, 2.47 more targets, and 23.3 more receiving yards per game than his previous career highs in 2019. If this turns out to be a fluke year and Andrews drops back down closer to his career averages of 4.24 receptions on 6.27 targets for 55.9 receiving yards and 0.47 receiving touchdowns per game, he will be a disappointment at his current ADP. The last major concern I have with Mark Andrews' fantasy profile is Lamar Jackson's career passing numbers. Lamar Jackson is a game breaker from a rushing standpoint, but his career passing numbers leave something to be desired. Jackson has averaged 17.93 completions on 27.60 passing attempts for 208.71 passing yards and 1.86 passing touchdowns per game over the last 3 seasons of 42 regular season games according to Pro Football Reference. Outside of the passing touchdown numbers, the rest of these numbers are all well below average and may limit Andrews' fantasy upside. Some additional thoughts on Mark Andrews' fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Mark Andrews finished as the TE1 in standard with 194.1 total fantasy points and 11.4 fantasy points per game. The TE1 in half PPR formats with 247.6 total fantasy points and 14.6 fantasy points per game, and the TE1 in full PPR formats with 301.1 total fantasy points and 17.7 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, Mark Andrews had 1 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 17 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Mark Andrews had the 13th most yards after the catch in the entire NFL last year, with 458 yards after the catch according to Pro Football Reference. Efficiency. Mark Andrews averaged 2.65 yards per route run, the second best among tight ends, 8.8 yards per target, the sixth best among tight ends, 12.7 yards per reception, the seventh best among tight ends, and 2.23 yards per team passing attempt, the best among tight ends in 2021 according to Player Profiler. Personal opinion. Mark Andrews is currently going off the board as TE2, about pick 27 overall on ESPN, and TE2, about pick 24 overall on Yahoo. I think he's a safe bet to finish as a top tier fantasy tight end again, and I do love having an elite fantasy tight end on my roster. But of the top 5 tight ends of Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, Pitts, and Waller, Andrews has the least appealing ADP to me because he's the second most costly and hasn't quite shown the year-to-year consistency that Kelsey has yet, as Kelsey has been a top 2 fantasy tight end for over half a decade. For me personally, I would rather use that draft capital to take a shot on a guy like Saquon Barkley, who is currently going later than Andrews on both platforms in the late second, early third round of drafts, and then just grab the best available of the Kittle, Pitts, Waller tier in the 4th round to get my upper end fantasy tight end. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Mark Andrews' My Cause My Cleats in the past was for the JDRF Diabetes Foundation. Andrews is a type 1 diabetic himself and has constantly spread awareness and shown support for those who have diabetes. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.